Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Canon 211. I am your host. My name is Jake Fowler, and I'm co-hosting, actually, this installment of Canon 211 with the inestimable Father Michael Rennier. Father, hello. Good evening.
I've been promoted. Thank you.
You have been promoted. I'll let Monsignor know. And we are both delighted to have here with us Dr. Thomas Pfau. Dr. Pfau is on faculty at Duke. And I think 3 different departments, if I'm not mistaken, Dr. Pfau. English, German, and theology. Is that correct?
That used to be correct until about 2 years ago when I requested that my appointment in German be dissolved because it was just becoming too much administrative work.
Indeed. So only, I say that with tongue-in-cheek, only teaching in 2 different departments at Duke and in the divinity school to boot. So colleagues with Dr. Peter Casarella, right? Yes. He's been on the show before. We chatted about Romano Guardini and the technocratic paradigm. That was a lovely installment. But enough about that. So this evening, we'll be discussing Dr. Pfau's article in the winter issue of the new Ressourcement journal produced by Word on Fire. And the title of it, forgive my French, it's horrible. Parole totalement intelligible. Is that right? Or close, perhaps?
Close.
It's close enough for English speakers. Okay. And the subtitle, Paul Claudel's Cosmic Poetics. So right before we pressed the record button, I was just mentioning to Dr. Pfau how Father Rennier turned me on to Paul Claudel. Inadvertently, he didn't know what he was doing when he simply mentioned, I think you mentioned it in the homily, Father. And I thought, well, if Father Rennier says Claudel, I should know who this is. So I look it up, I get a book. Here's the one you get, everybody. 5 Great Odes by Paul Claudel. He was a French poet. He was a diplomat around the turn of the 20th century. And I finished reading these odes, and lo and behold, here's a scholarly article discussing Paul Claudel. So I couldn't wait for this to be published. In fact, I made such a stir and embarrassed myself rushing to Dr. Pfau that he was so gracious to send me a copy of it prior to it actually being published and sent out. So that was very kind of you. But Dr. Pfau, perhaps we can begin. Maybe you can tell us what Claudel means to you personally, and then let's jump into the substance of your article. Is that all right?
Yeah, that sounds good. So, like so many academic pursuits of the last 5 years, my interest in Claudel really was also the byproduct of COVID. There was simply a lot more time to stay at home and read, and in fact also just re-immerse myself in French literature and French theology. And Claudel quite immediately grabbed my attention, and he has such a distinctive voice that I found myself enthralled. I should say that my work began and has by and large still been limited to his poetry. I've mostly focused on the 5 odes and on his earlier collection of prose poems called Connaissance de l'Est, Knowing the East, which in many ways is the first attempt to create a fusion of his dearly held Thomism with poetry. And so over the last 5 years, I've sort of found myself reading Claudel, in the Pléiade edition, and also getting his wonderfully interesting correspondence with various writers and intellectuals. Given his occupation, he obviously had a very wide range of acquaintances. So I sort of gradually assembled a picture of an unusual intellect. I'm sure we'll get into why he is so unusual. Several aspects that stand out.
Excellent. So this article then, Claudel's Cosmic Poetics. What was the motivation? I know this sort of dovetails with the keynote address you delivered at the Word on Fire conference or
Yeah.
the new Ressourcement conference recently.
Mhm.
What led you to want to write this particular article?
Well, the article is really excised from a long, about 3 times as long section of forthcoming or a book that I have in the works on poetry and theology
Hmm.
between 1800 and the mid 20th century. And Claudel is one of 4 major figures in it. My approach has been in various endeavors to really read sort of comprehensively and then try and distill what I take to be the main lineaments of someone's mode of thinking and writing. And so this article was essentially that, an attempt to capture Claudel's conception of creation and the way that he tries to relate the word, the poetic word, to the creative word of God. That's
Hmm.
fundamentally the interest that brought me to this article. Now, Claudel himself, it has to be said, tried to give a fairly comprehensive account of how he understood the relationship between poetry and theology when he wrote his Art Poetique, his poetic art,
Mhm.
in 1904, which really is why I spend about 1/3 of the article on sort of capturing the main outlines of his vision there. Um, One of the things about Claudel is, and this actually brings me to one of the main points I suppose one should make. It's often been customary to distinguish between what Friedrich Schiller, the German poet of the late 18th century, called either naive or sentimental writers. The
Hmm.
naive writer is someone who, in a way, proceeds on the strength of intuitions without trying to sift them in a very complex way. Whereas the sentimental is really more to be a highly reflective and philosophical poet. Now, curiously, I think Claudel manages to be both. In his poetic theory, he unusually unfolds a very comprehensive sort of account of the word in relation to God, of the poetic word and of language in relation to God, and especially to God's self-manifestation in creation. But in the poetry, one often has the sense of the language being sort of very immediate and quite forthright without trying to either conform to any particular classical model of the ode or to any conception of sort of recognizably literary writing.
Mhm.
So he has, he's entirely sui generis. And so that's stood out for me and still does.
Yeah, I think that's right. So when I read the odes, what stands out to me is that he doesn't really work under a specific form, and you can almost sense that he has so much he wants to name. He's trying to name these realities, and he's so excited about it. He's really just sort of going for it. And in one way, the form of the poetry suffers, but in the other way, you get something very unique, and I think uniquely powerful, which is that Claudelian voice, that Claudelian poetics, which tremendously impresses me. Uh, Professor, you brought up this idea that he's naming,
Mhm.
and I know often he talks about how as the poet he has this responsibility to name that which he sees, to give it some sort of poetic reality, or to almost um, become a sort of a pontifex for it, right? A bridge builder
Mhm.
um, between what he's seeing and the reality of it. And I think that's probably his Thomist background, that analogical relationship.
Yeah.
Uh, it's interesting, though, that Maritain, right? So I've always wondered about this. So Maritain, and maybe you can enlighten me, because I get a little. I'm not a great philosopher, so sometimes I hear these guys go back and forth, and I get confused and give up. But Maritain would critique Claudel because Claudel said, "Well, you can name these things," whereas Maritain seemed to have a more humble approach to it, saying, well, the things need to suggest the names to us. We're like children playing. I think that's the metaphor he uses. We're like children playing, and poetry is a great game. I don't know if you have any insight or a way to sort of. I almost feel like they're talking past each other, and they're both saying the same
I think
thing.
that's right. Yeah, I think they are. I think Maritain somehow formed, I think, a mistaken impression that for Claudel to name things was in some ways a definitive act, almost like predicating something of them.
Right.
But I think the name has actually a far more foundational quality in the way that we name a child. To name our child is not to presume that we know it in some exhaustive way. Quite on the contrary. It is, in a way, to sort of give a starting point for a reality that will then gradually reveal itself to us. So in my article, I quote Robert Sokolowski, who very nicely puts this as follows when he says that to name a thing is to begin an adventure in manifestation, not to conclude it. And to name a thing is to bring it and its intelligibility to mind. It is not just to bump into the thing. So there are two aspects here. On the one hand, to name something is to acknowledge that it has a reality that is independent of what I may or may not be able to predicate of it. To name something or someone is to acknowledge them as a reality, as a presence. And to acknowledge them in a way that does not presume to exercise some form of epistemic dominion over them. We don't. So I think Maritain misconstrued that. On the other hand, to name things is also in a way to understand that we are in a way not just doing this as it were arbitrarily or in some sort of purely elective and discretionary way. I name something because I feel that its presence is already calling on me, so that I see myself in a way as the addressee of what I name. I'm not simply sort of venturing a name as though I could or could choose to do otherwise. I do so because in a way I'm already spoken to by the things which I now name. And that is really to establish the sort of ground zero for what is then to be an evolving relationship of knowledge of things. So that's how I would sort of defend, I think, Claudel. That said, Maritain, of course, did pick up on something about Claudel's sensibility. There is a kind of, he tends to give everything that he addresses in his poetry, he tends to give a bear hug. He sort of just brings it into his orbit, and there is something overwhelming. One of his friends, it might have been André Gide, had, I think, referred to him once as a frozen cyclone, a kind of cyclone that sort of just turns in place. He had that kind of ebullient personality, which I have to say has always perplexed me, considering that he worked most of his life as a diplomat. Diplomatic, he was not always. Clearly, he was supremely gifted. I mean, he became, ambassador to Japan and then to the United States. So obviously the top jobs in the French foreign ministry, but still. And it wasn't easy for him to get them because he was a Catholic. And in the Third Republic, that was a serious strike against one. And it took actually the intervention of some dear friends to prevent his detractors, and there were some in the ministry, from preventing him from moving forward, despite his talents, which were obvious.
So it seems that from reading your article and from reading the odes, and at the conclusion, he doesn't sign them, but he puts the date and the name of the city. Was Claudel also a diplomat in China at some point?
Yes. Oh yeah, he was.
Okay, so let me ask then, to what extent do you think his time in the East shaped his understanding of what you've called his cosmic poetics? Because it's a different world. I mean, it's the same world, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, no, it's very different.
It doesn't get much more different in China than it does in France. So,
In pre-revolutionary, late imperial China,
indeed.
indeed. So he starts out actually in Tianjin, which is a small backwater town at the time, as simply as a minor consular official, just as one would expect someone to start out when joining that service. And he spends off and on most of 25 years in the Far East. So from about 1896 or 97 until, with some interruptions, but not that long, until 1927, when I believe um, he's in then he becomes ambassador in the US. There are intermediate postings. He will be in Brazil during World War One, and he is also at the beginning of World War One. He is in Hamburg, Germany, and actually getting out of Germany at that moment on August 1st, 1914, turned out to be quite a tricky thing. Yes, first of all, I mean, Brazil, China, Japan, um, Belgium, the United States, and he traveled the United States widely. So he has, unusually for most poets, he has a much more comprehensive uh, exposure to the world. Um, and his Knowing the East, that early collection of prose poems, is extraordinarily interested in both Chinese and to a lesser extent also in Japanese culture, because what he observes there, and this is something I'm working out in a different article that hopefully will appear in Literature and Theology. What he does there is he realizes that in some ways the uh, the art of the Far East, being so utterly uninterested in Western notions of verisimilitude and mimesis, might actually give resources for conveying theological views about the world that are harder to convey in the tradition of 19th century realism. And so this is one of the things that his arguably Claudel's best reader, and certainly the most informed, is a professor in France, Dominique Millet-Gérard, who has written both on Claudel's Thomism and on his poetry and many things besides. And she has, I think, made a very compelling argument about Claudel's view, where he believes that in some ways the strategies of depicting the world that the Far East presents might actually be more effective, because you don't have to cut through all the established expectations of, say, for that would be in the minds of readers raised on Flaubert and Zola. So it's a very interesting decision of Claudel's. Um, while he is abroad, he's also in a way, and that I think was for him a boon, that was actually a benefit. He is even further removed from the so-called literary establishment of the Third Republic France, with which he never really got on very well, because he had a keen dislike for the sort of ramrod, axiomatic secularism of that establishment, and in that sense, never felt like he wanted to be there. In his late interviews with Jean Amrouche from 1953, I believe, Memoir improvisé, improvised memoirs, he says, most poets say they want to come home. He said, I always wanted to leave. So that was his sensibility.
It seems like his travels certainly. I mean, it's cliche to say they broadened his horizons, but I think
Yeah.
it comes through in some of the ways that he writes. And
Oh yeah.
I don't have the literary vocabulary to describe it. I sense it.
Yeah.
I want to go back to something that you both mentioned a few minutes ago. And Father, we've spoken about this in the parking lot after Mass. There's this. It seems like there's this concept where the naming something is almost like calling it into being, almost like you're inviting it. And not that we've created it, but you're bringing it into your orbit, so to speak. And so, Father, you've said that the poet is sort of like a hierarch in that way. And so I wonder, Dr. Pfau, and Father, if you have comments, how does Claudel, is he doing that? And how is he doing that? Or is naming for him taking him in a different direction?
So the figure from which Claudel really wants to set himself apart, because he's worried that one might confuse their approaches, is Stéphane Mallarmé. Now, in the case of Mallarmé, you have a writer who really believed that he could, as it were, constitute reality in a purely verbal and textual way, so that there is no reality beyond that which poetry of a particular kind brings into being. So a kind of hermetically enclosed textual universe. Claudel actually thought that was a disaster. In fact, his long essay on Mallarmé from, I think, 1926 is called La Catastrophe de Igitur, which is the catastrophe of this particular work by Mallarmé. So what for Claudel, and you put this already in the, I think, just exactly right. I mean, the name is first of all an acknowledgement that the words that we use are always responding to a reality that is beyond them and exceeds them in every conceivable way. So to name something is precisely to acknowledge the sort of what I call the metaphysical stability, the order and the intelligibility of creation. So that means that Claudel works in ways that Mallarmé or Valéry don't. He works fundamentally with a conception of analogia. All language is understood as standing in an analogical, not in a tautological or isomorphous way. It stands in the analogical relationship to the real. In his late interviews with Jean Amrouche, he actually says that the idea of the analogia entis was first broached for him by what he read in Aquinas. But then he said it became even more clear to him when he read Bonaventure. Interestingly, he read in the Summa as well as in the Vulgate pretty much every day. We know that one of his great losses was occurred on September 1st, 1923, during the Great Kanto earthquake in Japan, which was the most horrific earthquake of that century that Japan experienced. And he was there, fairly new at the time, and the French embassy was also destroyed by fire and collapse, and all his papers and books were lost, including his 5-volume edition of Aquinas, which he had painstakingly annotated. So it, gave him
That's painful.
reason to do it again.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think that's really. I think you put your finger on something interesting there with his relationship with some of the other writers of the time who have that tautological idea, which essentially is idolatry, right? It's confusing the appearances with the reality, which is the great flaw of modernity. Going back further, there's a in sort of the pagan times, the pre-Christian times, there's much more of this idea of participation, right? Everything's enchanted, the gods are in everything, and that begins to separate with, correct me if I'm wrong, but probably Plato around that time. The appearances and the reality begin to separate a little bit philosophically. But the medieval still very much lived in a symbolic world. And Claudel, to me, seems to be, in that sense, very much medieval. And he's trying to recover that concept of participation, right? But that in naming things, and you make this point very well in your article, Professor, that in naming it, we're not simply acknowledging it or saying this is over here, or I'm sort of defining this or categorizing this or incorporating it into my poetic art. But there's some sort of empathetic unfolding, I think, right, in which certainly we're participating ourselves in a greater reality, this great logos, the word, the creative word. But I think also in some mysterious way with each other, with other beings, as we are looking very carefully and very attentively at these appearances and seeing that there's something else under there, defined by an analogical relationship, but that something else under there is very much worth knowing and understanding and communing with.
Yes. I think that's right. And this notion of participation, I mean, you mentioned Plato as a point where that concept begins to, or the concept of the relationship between appearance and reality begins to be somewhat unstable.
Correct me if I'm wrong on that.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, as it happens, my most recent book from 2022 is on is on conceptions of the image.
Oh, you know what?
And that, there you have it. Yeah,
There it is.
and I discuss Plato in it. I
Do you? I haven't read it yet. It's I'll read it tonight.
It's a short text.
Right.
You could probably finish it soon.
You'll get right through it. Yeah.
Yes.
But the concept with Plato, you have actually a fascinating figure. I would say Claudel is generally somewhat hesitant about Plato. So I don't want to sort of dwell too much on it, but Plato, I think, changes his mind. The sort of very militant rejection of poetry, of mimesis as some form of illicit copying that we find in Book 10 of the Republic. I'm not even sure that that's really a position that one can ultimately say is truly what Plato is about. I think his conception of methexis, of participation, as he works it out in the Sophist in particular, is far more nuanced. The question, I think, for Claudel becomes, however, not just about how to conceive of the relationship between appearance and reality, but he is now also confronting in Poetics by Mallarmé, Valéry to some extent, which essentially rejects the distinction, which essentially suggests that reality is only what we posit it as being, that there is no reality independent of whatever constructions or assertions or representations we venture. That unless and until we have given and imprinted a form on the world, there is really no world. And an extreme case of that is Mallarmé. And for Claudel, that seems completely implausible. And again, I would have to assume that the fact that he's just traveled widely and has just absorbed with every one of his senses the extraordinary richness of how the world, the variety of ways in which the world gives itself in experience, made that view of the world completely implausible. If you have been around the entire globe and have spent so much time in different cultures, I would think it will induce a certain kind of epistemic humility. And I think he exhibits that. So that's why I think he's, as I put it, he conceives of poetic speech as participation in a timeless logos, but a logos that for him is endlessly present. It is not a logos that is somehow removed, but a logos that endlessly manifests itself and that stages the drama of creation for us every waking day in myriad forms. So there is nothing notional about the logos. There's nothing abstract about it for Claudel.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's the beauty of it. It's these concrete poetic images.
Yeah.
They're not abstractions at all.
So let's look at one. So the section 2 of your article concerns the second of his great odes, L'Esprit et l'eau, the spirit and the water. And so here we have Claudel drawing a parallel, and there seems to be almost a perichoresis, a mutual intertwining of water, earthly water, or I should say physical water, and spirit. And so can you walk us through section 2 a bit as we consider the second ode?
Yes. So the second ode is, in some ways, perhaps the most cosmic of his 5 odes, which it has the widest view of them all, I would say. He writes it in Imperial China, and so writes it in a world that gives him, and I suppose most people who would be alert and observant, gives them every bit of indication that it is on the verge of collapse. The old imperial order really has very little of a future as far as he can tell. So no, he is there sitting, as he says, in the whirlwind, full of dust and straw and the dirty laundry of the whole town. Written, as he says, the ode is written, quote, near a marigold palace among the many-roofed trees, shading a rotted throne in the principal ruin of an old empire, far from the free and pure sea, loin de la mer libre et pure. This antithesis of the transient world of empires, and not just China. He would have included France in that world too. That is to say, the transience of any order, political, social, and economic, that humankind may evolve at some point, sort of is thrown into relief for him by the sort of expanses of the water that he had to cross as he comes to China on ship. And so he sees there's a kind of resonance with, let's say, the primitivism of Paul Gauguin. You have a feeling that he wants to escape, and in this sense he is very much the heir of Arthur Rimbaud. He wants to escape a kind of suffocating and moribund culture. He sees signs of its fading all around. So what he wants, in a way, is to reclaim a vision of physical and spiritual purity, a source, the water at its source, of unfiltered, abundant, inexhaustible, what he says, the sea, the mother, the element itself. L'élément même, la matière première, c'est la mer, je dis, qu'il me faut. And that's what the poetry initially is about. He then sort of interpolates in the midsections of the poem also a critique of this sort of smug secularism of his own world, of the French world. And, there are, I'm sort of looking for the passage here. There are sort of some somewhat polemic passages in it in which he really expresses his distaste with, both in this and in the third ode, with the French intellectual culture. But he also has a way of allowing the water to sort of do work at a variety of levels. There is the sea that he traverses. There is also the baptismal water of Christianity, and in some ways the blessing of the baptismal waters is actually a liturgical piece that he incorporates into his poem. At a certain moment, I think I do talk about that. Yes, where he says, this is actually something critics haven't always paid attention to, I would say, but this, blessing of the baptismal water, a composite of, lines from Old and New Testament writings. And he, of course, here would have worked with the pre-1955 pre-Vatican II Missal, where the rites were far more detailed and also include, in an image that Claudel actually invokes, the priest breathing onto the water in the sign of the cross. Something he expressly references. So the water then is, but again, it would be a mistake, I think, to say that water then becomes simply a metaphor. It's not. That would trivialize it, because the water that is the element from which all life grows is surely not a metaphor. It is something far more real than the kind of fleeting world of appearances in which we ordinarily find ourselves.
So, Professor, you're talking to a priest who has blessed the font in the old rite. So I have breathed on the baptismal waters in precisely the manner you described, and the rites are beautiful. And I think they really captured Claudel's imagination. I remember, I think it's in one of the appendices, maybe in A Poet Before the Cross, Before the Foot of the Cross. And he talks about, if he could design a church, what would it look like? And essentially, he comes up with this underground womb that has a lot of water elements to it. And I find it so fascinating that was what that's how he would prefer to worship, because that's such an important poetic image to him. And I think it makes sense when we think about his own conversion. He was literally converted by a poem from the mouth of Our Lady, his mother.
Yes, the conversion experience in 1886 in Notre Dame in Paris on December 25th was, of course, an absolutely key event for Claudel. Although it is very interesting in his little essay from 1913, Ma Conversion, My Conversion, he also says, I believed and something had profoundly changed in him. But he also says, it took me several more years to understand what this meant, what I had converted to. He said, all the old verities, all the old sort of intellectual verities of his time, the kind of knowledge that, Michelet and Renan and sort of liberal Catholics or rabidly anti-Catholic intellectuals of his time. All that, he said, that building, he said, still stood, but I had just stepped out of it. And so that was a key event, of course, for him. One of the things that's interesting about, it's also especially interesting in his Magnificat in the third ode. Claudel's relationship to the Catholic Church is complex.
Yes.
on the one hand, he was a devout, practicing Catholic ever after, and there was absolutely no question about it. He could also be, and actually in his journals from the years of World War II, he could also be quite scathing of bishops in some cases who cooperated with the German forces or with Marshal Pétain, and who, pretended that nothing was going on. He says, one day there were 26 young men shot because they had refused to be pressed into German work service. And he said that on the same day in the same town, the bishop went about his business as though nothing had happened. He found that unforgivable. What I think the center for Claudel, as crucial and as much as the church is a crucial and guiding presence in his life, but the true center of it is for his life was always scripture. And as you probably know, I mean, since you already mentioned the Poetry for the Cross, which is a small portion of well over 2,000 small printed pages of biblical commentary that Claudel writes.
I'm aware of these. I don't read French, and I can't find them in translation. And I'm on a quest to get them translated by someone who's more intelligent than me.
I have on my
easier
shelf,
to just learn French.
Probably. I have on my shelf up there, I have the first of 2 volumes, each about 1,800 pages in small print and a big book. It's what he did pretty much after he retired from the diplomatic service in 1933 at age 65. He knew very well that as a diplomat in the service of the Third Republic, he could not publish such books while he was active on behalf of the government. The government wouldn't have allowed for it. In fact, he says about the odes, he says, I would have preferred if they could just be published with my initials, because he thought probably had to get permission to publish them at all. I think in the end, he went ahead without that, but he would have preferred to just not do that. His commentary on scripture and what you mentioned, the example about the church, is absolutely representative. It's very idiosyncratic. I mean, for him, that he's not trying to be a commentator in some kind of academic way.
Right.
That's the last thing he would ever want.
Those commentaries have to have treasures in them, and we need to get a grad student on this job of translating these at the very least, because he reads the scriptures as a poet, and he's reading them with a different eye. So his commentaries, just the few things he says in the Poet Before the Cross, are absolutely amazing to me. I've used them multiple times in homilies, which is probably where Jake first heard it.
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to read a section, if that's all right. This is on page 804, goes into 805 a little bit. It's a lengthy paragraph, but I think it's worth it. And then that will prompt a final question. I can hear my children stirring downstairs, so we should probably at least begin to think about bringing this to a close. But here we are on page 804. And referencing the second ode, even as the poem's opening pages may at first glance read like a case of romantic pantheism and expressivism run amok, a mix of Emersonian self-deification, Whitman-esque effusiveness, and Rimbaudian primitivism, they already point toward a more measured Catholic poetics that the poem's remainder gradually unfolds for us. In fact, this opening assertion of mastery, of limitless self-confidence, and an effortless rapport between consciousness and cosmos, spirit and water, already tells us that the poetic word can never be truly owned and controlled by the poet. So this goes back to what we were saying before. I'll go on a little further. Rather, it, the poetic word, can be properly understood only as echoing the creative utterance of God's actus purus. Throughout his ode, Claudel insists on the ontological bond between divine creation and the inspired word, between the gradual beginning of the waters divided by God and the responsive stirring of human speech. So that when I read that for the first time, I think it finally had clicked. And what I believe had clicked, and I'm interested to see if I'm on the right track, is the way a Catholic might write poetry. And we've been dancing around this the whole time, but I would like to just ask very directly, what is poetics to Claudel in particular, but to Catholics in general, and not to sound well. I want anyone who views this to walk away thinking that their faith is now enriched. And so, what can the average Catholic take away from someone like Claudel in terms of a worldview, apprehending reality, and so on? So, what is the Catholic poetics in general to Claudel, and then why should other people care?
That's a big question. Of course, as you said, it's sort of the most fundamental and question to ask. I would say, first and foremost, there are many varieties of Catholic poetics. But I think here I would actually refer to an essay by T.S. Eliot from 1935, Literature and Religion, in which Eliot says that religious poetry should not be confused with devotional poetry, which is to say, the point of the poetry, if it is to be a kind of theologically informed and aspiring statement, is not simply to dress up doctrinal views that could just as easily be voiced in ordinary prose. It is rather to stage for us what it means, and for Eliot, this means something very different than for Claudel, but what it means to be a Christian, and in particular for Claudel, a Catholic. The first thing that stands out for Claudel is that the Christian vision of a poet, but frankly, he feels of any Catholic, must begin with creation. Even though in early years Claudel was quite intrigued by Blaise Pascal, in later years he absolutely rejects him, in large measure because in Pascal you find very little about creation. For Pascal, the religious life begins with sin, with the fall, not with creation. And for Claudel, that's getting it wrong from the start. And he says that quite clearly. So, in short, the Catholic view of a Catholic poetics must be, as Claudel in his 1927 lecture in Baltimore at the American Catholic Congress says, he says, I think the lecture is called Poetry and Religion. He says, all true poetry is the language of praise. It begins and it must end with praise. Any other motive for writing may have its place, but it cannot be the end of poetic speech. So that, I think, sets him apart from any variety of other important Christian poets, with the possible exception, I might say, of one of the other writers I work on again in my book, Gerard Manley Hopkins. Yeah. But it sets him, for instance, quite a bit apart from someone like T.S. Eliot, whose entire outlook is very different. The world in Eliot, except for momentary sort of epiphanic moments, the world never quite seems to enter into the conception of the religious life. Whereas for Claudel, all of reality is God's manifestation. And we must learn to listen and to receive it in all possible ways that we are, by our senses and by our mental gifts, enabled to do. There is nothing monastic or retiring about Claudel. I mentioned this in part because he actually wanted to be considered to join the Benedictine orders. And I don't know who the superior was, but he got it right when he says, "You are not suited for this."
Mhm.
He certainly wasn't, because he was. There was nothing. He was not. Um, he lacked the. I would say he lacked a certain mystical element, which I think, you know, like any good writer or artist, he knew where his strength lay, and he worked with those. But yeah, it's that one, by the way, was a big event for him when he was told that the Benedictines did not think he was temperamentally suited for the order, for taking orders in there as a monk. It took him a while to understand it, and I think in time to come, with time he learned to realize that they had been quite right.
Excellent, Father Rennier. Any concluding thoughts, reflections, objections, criticisms?
No, just gratitude. I really enjoyed this. So thank you, Dr. Pfau.
Well, thank you.
And I look forward to your next book. I'll be your first purchaser.
Well, I look forward to it too. My hope is it'll be maybe 2 years or so, and then, God willing, I've written all the major chapters on Friedrich Hölderlin, the German pietist, and Hopkins, Claudel, and Eliot.
These are all my
now
favorites.
now the introduction remains to be done. And then there's a book beyond that, because the Eliot piece is so comprehensive that I left 4 quartets out. I'm going to write a separate book on that.
Oh,
yeah.
Well, you've given us a lot to look forward to, and you'll be hearing from me when those books come out. So maybe we can have another conversation for sure.
Sounds wonderful. Thank you so much.
Oh, absolutely. I suppose that's as good a spot as any to call it quits for this evening. I'm almost out of bourbon. It's Lent anyways. I shouldn't be doing that. Dr. Pfau, once more, thank you on behalf of Father Rennier.
Thank you very much.
This has been a real treat, honestly, just to glean from your wisdom about a man whom the both of us admire and read frequently. I take the 5 odes to Mass, and I read them before Mass so that I can pray a little more effectively. At least I think I can. Anyway, ladies and gents, if you have benefited from Dr. Pfau's work, consider purchasing his books, the giant one, and then the other ones that will probably be a little smaller when they come out. Let's patronize this treasure that the church has been tucking away at Duke University. We won't hold it against you that it's a Protestant school. Father went to Yale, so you guys have that in common. All right, that's the last thing to say. I always close reminding my audience to never give up, to keep on smiling, and to remember that one day you will die.